Okay, I got 11 o'clock, so let's go ahead and get started. I haven't seen you guys forever, it seems, right? It's been such a weird month in between sort of spring break, Easter break, and then illness and conferences. Like I've seen like 3 times in the last month, it seems. Anyway, long and the short of it is we're here to stay now, right? No more breaks before the end of the semester. Knock wood. We'll see what happens. I don't walk in front of a taxi cab or something after saying that, right? So we've got some catching up to do. I'm almost done grading your progress reports. I didn't want to privilege the A through L people by sending them back as soon as I got them done, right? That's just kind of not fair. So my normal practice is wait till I finish them all and then email everybody like in quick succession. So you should be getting comments back. It'll be like before a grading rubric and comments on the actual progress report, and you get those back within the next 24 hours, right? You guys are almost finished, and I'm doing yours before I move on to map revision class, okay? So this afternoon, perhaps, more likely first thing in the morning, but within the next 24 hours, you get comments back on that with the grading, okay? So that's forthcoming. The worksheets will come after that, after I get through my upper division class and its grading, then I'll jump into the worksheets after that and start to get those back to you. Since I haven't graded them yet, if you have worksheets you haven't turned in, I will accept them still. Get them to me sort of before the end of the weekend, all right? And that way, you know, you can get caught up and won't shoot yourself in the foot, because that's kind of the easiest part of your grade, is your worksheets, right? So if you've got any outstanding worksheets you haven't turned in, send them to me. I'll take them up till the end of the weekend, because I can't be rigid with your deadlines when I'm running behind. That's just not fair, right? Because we're all in this together. Okay? So again, worksheets. If you've got any outstanding before the end of the weekend, progress reports, you'll get email back with that within the next 24 hours. Okay? So where were we when we left off? We were talking about. I believe we were here, right? We had sort of did about as far as we got was the Benjamin West. Is that correct? Yeah. We were talking about neoclassicism, which is this movement in the later part of the 18th century, lasts into the very early part of the 19th century, where artists are coming up with much more, classical compositions. And by that I mean they're turning to ancient mythology as a reference point, using mythological scenes as the basis for images that are meant to sort of teach us lessons about the modern day. This relates directly to the Enlightenment, and in particular Voltaire, the philosopher Voltaire, who said that we should study history in order to inform our actions in the present, right? In order to look to history for what he called an exemplum virtutis, examples of virtue, examples of proper behavior, right? That's the what we see the most of, but at the same time, we sometimes see history just being mined for allegorical parallels, right? So with both Kaufman and West, both active in England, right? It's an international phenomenon. We started off by looking at France, but here we're looking at England. We'll look at America next. Both of them are looking back to ancient history and finding parallels between it either on the moral level with Kaufman or on the historical level with West, right? West gives us Helen brought to Paris, the theme that started the Trojan War, to sort of give voice to his fears for a coming war between England and America. If you look at the date, it's obvious we're right there. And if you remember, he was the court painter to the King of England, to King George III. He was the official history painter to King George. And this image, as the shadow falls across Cupid, as Venus is brought to Paris, the face that launched 1,000 ships, which is the harbinger of the coming Trojan War, West sees this as an allegory for the coming, the conflicts that are happening between the colonies in Britain and the idea that there's a coming war there as well. On the left, Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi, shows a Roman mother with her 2 sons. She teaches the older son, who in turn teaches the younger son. They are her jewels, right? That's her response to the greedy neighbor, right? who says, these are my jewels, where are yours? And it's all about sort of the importance of mothering, which comes out of philosophy at the time. And her two sons, as we know from Roman history, these two Gracchus brothers, will in fact each grow up to be a prefect of Rome, lead Rome, and champion human rights, right? So all these ideas are wrapped up within neoclassicism. And at the same time, when we talk about a classical approach to art, in addition to the subject matter, there's this idea of a style that's not particularly spontaneous, where every element has been thought through with rather detailed preparatory studies leading to the final composition. So all we got to think about is our Renaissance artists like Raphael or Michelangelo make hundreds of drawings before they start painting. Or Nicolas Poussin, who we talked about in the 17th century, who made all those little wax figures, clay figures, and shined lights on them, right, after making drawings, and then made drawings from that before he finally made the finished work. There's nothing particularly spontaneous here. And that's one of the other ways we define neoclassicism, is through this sort of classical academic approach to art, which champions thoughtfulness rather than creativity or spontaneity, right? So this is all hallmarks of neoclassicism. Benjamin West was born and raised in the colonies before moving back to England as the tensions rose between England and America, or the colonies, because in fact he was a supporter of the monarchy in Britain, what we call in American politics a Tory, right? So too was John Singleton Copley. He too was raised in the colonies, and as the tensions got higher, he too moved back to England. Both of them tried to parlay their experience in the colonies toward a career as a British artist, trying to market themselves as people who benefited from that experience of living here, right, and could tell the people of Britain that they can depict things as they truly were out here. We don't see that much in the West picture, but we do see it in the Copley, because he depicts a historical event from some 30 years earlier, where Brooke Watson was swimming in, and I don't know if he fell overboard if he was swimming, in Havana Harbor, right, the harbor of Havana, Cuba, and was attacked by a shark, right? And we see here the daring rescue of Brooke Watson. And this was in the news in the 1770s, 30 years after it happened, because Brooke Watson survived this. You see him staring into the mouth of death, right? He survives this. They do, in fact, rescue him. And he goes on to being a member of Parliament, and at this point in the 1770s, he was elected Lord Mayor of London. So this was kind of thematic topical, right? This is the thing that happened to him as a kid, and why, in fact, he's walking around on a peg leg, because the shark actually went at him twice, and it's already gotten to him. And in fact, you can see, if you look closely at the foreground, his proper right leg is missing from the knee down, and the bloody stump goes into the water. So the shark's already had appetizers, right, coming around for the main dish. And they're going to do their darndest to stave off the shark while they rescue Brooke Watson. You can see, we can forgive Copley for not having the most convincing looking shark, right? He didn't posing sharks in his studio, not particularly likely. But you can see he makes an attempt to show you how monstrously large that fish is. It's not a fish, right? It's a man. What is it? It's an ichthy. I forget this. It's been a long time since I took biology, right? But it's not classically. It's still, you see the size of the thing, right? The size of the creature with the tail in the background as it sweeps around, and the horror on Brooke Watson's face as he, they've thrown in a rope that's wrapped around his arm, and it looks like he's about had it, right? Staring directly into the dead eye of the fish, kind of like the end of Jaws with Robert Shaw on the deck there trying to kick at the thing to stay alive, right? So it's a horrifying scene in a way, but one that was thematically relevant in the 1770s because Brooke Watson here's a teenager, but by the time this was painted 30 years later, he had moved to a high political office, right? Now, you might ask yourself whether he fell off or was swimming, what's he doing naked, right? Why did Copley choose, it's not a photograph, why did Copley choose to depict him without his clothes on? Are we meant to believe that the strong current in Havana Harbor ripped his clothes from his body, that the fish got him and tore him off? Probably not. One of the things that Copley's trying to do is to, I think, give us some idea of where he got that pose from. Because we look at the pose of Brooke Watson, what we see is, in fact, that it directly borrows from a very, very famous Greek sculpture. In particular, Laocoon in the center, or you could argue the sun on the left, right? Probably more likely the sun on the left. Now, this was very, very well-known work of art. It was actually unearthed during Michelangelo's time. Michelangelo was there when they dug it up. So was Raphael in Rome when they found it. And it shows Laocoon was, and this is why it's important. But Neoclassicism loves ancient Greek art, right? So that's one thing we can focus on here, is that Neoclassicism loves ancient Greek art. But the second thing we can focus on is how Copley, as an artist, picks and chooses, and this is good for you guys that do art, how he picks and chooses the things he's going to borrow to enhance the meaning, right? So in this case, Laocoon is a priest in Troy, going back to the idea of the battle for Troy, right? The Trojan War. And as a priest in Troy, when the Spartans show up and they got that horse, right? Full of the guys inside, the story of the Trojan horse, right? They got the horse, they show up, and he says, this is dicey, right? Beware strangers bearing gifts. Don't let him in, because there's something that doesn't ring right about this. And the gods, the Greek gods, who were on the side of the Greeks, right? King Neptune sends sea serpents to kill him, to shut him up, both him and his sons. And so that's what our Greek sculptors have illustrated here, sea serpents coming to silence the priest Laocoon and his two sons, right? Now, if you think about Copley casting about, so to speak, for a reference point to use for the image, the idea of somebody who's attacked by monsters from the sea is duh, right? It's one of the most obvious things you'd go for. And that's exactly the case. So the body of Brooke Watson, naked, because it's modeled after a Greek sculpture, but the sculpture that he chooses isn't willy-nilly, right? He didn't just choose any old convenient work. He chose one that actually amplified the meaning of his piece. And that's something that we find artists doing regularly when they borrow from works of art of the past. And Copley's Watson and the Shark is actually an amalgam of 3 or 4 different references from earlier art, from other classical periods, and each one of them adds to the meaning of the scene. Right? So in addition to the body of Watson coming from one of Laocoon's sons, the figure who's spearing the shark is borrowed out of a Raphael that Copley had seen. He'd been to Rome, seen all these things firsthand. And Raphael did a pair of images of St. Michael vanquishing the demon. St. Michael is the vengeful archangel. And we see him here skewering a demon on whom he treads. And our figure at the prow of the boat is very much sort of lifted from Raphael and transformed into the purposes here. Right? Now again, that adds to meaning, doesn't it? Because where St. Michael vanquishes this horrifying demon from hell, well, so does the man at the prow of the ship, right? Also vanquishes this horrifying animal. Yeah. And then finally, if you look at the 2 men in white leaning over the side of the ship, about to grab Brooke Watson from the jaws of death, they borrowed directly from another Raphael that was also quite well known. Raphael was commissioned in 1515 to make a series of patterns that would be used for tapestries. Right? We call them cartoons. And these tapestries were designed to be hung underneath the Sistine ceiling by Michelangelo on the walls, right underneath. And the actual drawings that he made were shipped off to a tapestry factory, right, where they were then woven. But then the drawings stayed around and were collected and actually wound up back in London, where they are today. So Copley, living in London, had an opportunity to see this as well. And it shows Christ telling the apostles, who have been unlucky fishermen, that if you cast your nets on the other side of the boat, you're going to catch some fish. And so they do, and they have nets that are so full they can barely pull them up. Right? It's the miraculous draft of fishes, right? Where on Christ's command they find fish exactly where he tells them to look. Right? Jesus, the fisherman's friend. Right? And so we see in the background, precariously balanced on a small boat, pulling up the fish nets, loaded with fish. And that pose is directly borrowed for the two fellows in white, who are also having a miraculous pull, right? They have to miraculously rescue Brooke Watson from the shark. So the elements that Copley chooses all reflect neoclassicism's interests, right? Those periods of the past that were the most rational. Ancient Greece, they love ancient Rome, Italian Renaissance. But in borrowing these things, what Copley is able to do is to magnify, amplify the meaning of the piece. Right? Now, insofar as America is concerned, right, Copley and West grew up in the colonies and are often listed as American artists, but really they were Tories. They sided with the Brits. And at the moment of the revolution, or as we geared up toward the revolution of 1776, they went back to England because that's where their allegiances lie. And so while they're often listed as American artists, maybe we best understand them as British artists, right? Because that's in fact where many of their works were painted. However, back here in America, art is being produced by artists who stay around, also by foreign artists who come to visit. So Jean-Antoine Houdon is a French sculptor. He was responsible for the bust of Voltaire that we saw a week ago, right? It's in the National Gallery. And he is commissioned in 1783, takes him a long time, to do this over life-size statue of Washington for the State House in Virginia, for the Virginia state government. And to this day, it's in Richmond in the state capitol, right? And it illustrates a very important moment in Washington's life and a very important moment for American history. Washington had been the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army during the War of Independence, right? Now, that's not over in 1776, right? It lasts beyond that. And in 1783, as the war is winding down, as the fighting is winding down, Washington steps down as commander-in-chief. He goes back to private life. He retires to his farm right in Mount Vernon. Okay? Now, for America, this is key. This is absolutely crucial as a point of history because he did not turn military service directly into political service, which would be very easy to do and is kind of what happened all over the world. But America, defining itself as a democracy, this would not fly, right? It was important that the people call Washington to service, not that he simply flip it, right? which could have been very, very easy for him to do. He had the army on his side. They were loyal to him. He could have just, I'm going to be president, and nobody gets to say anything else otherwise. And that could have very easily happened. And even if everybody wanted him, right, it would have been a bad thing. So the idea that Washington steps down from military service is a really important element of how America wants to define itself in these very early years. Okay? So with Udomo's Washington, we see him still wearing his military coat, but he's laid aside his sword, and he's carrying a walking stick, which from what I've read, I don't know how they proved this, is the walking stick he used to use when he wandered around his farm in Mount Vernon, which he liked to do in his private life. So this is Washington between military service and presidency, right? He's a private citizen because he wasn't elected president until 1789, right, for his 8-year term, okay, or 2 4-year terms. This mythology, if you will, it's not a mythology because it's true, but this amplifying of the moment where Washington steps down, right, is really important to the point where it's one of the murals under the Capitol Dome, commissioned when the Capitol Dome was decorated after the War of 1812. You know this, that the U.S. Capitol burned in the War of 1812, right? So the dome that we see today was put up after that, right, in a couple of different phases. And the rotunda underneath it in 1820 was commissioned from a number of artists to illustrate the foundation and development of America. And it has everything from Columbus, right, to DeSoto discovering the Mississippi River, Pocahontas, right, and scenes around the Revolution, but peaceful ones, right, not battle scenes, right, but the establishment of peace and democracy. And so here, Washington has risen from that chair, which you can see is draped with this massive robe. So it's very, very royal. And he could conceivably just say, hey, that's it, right? But he stood up and he's handing in his resignation, right? And you'll notice in each of them that the pose is kind of similar, isn't it? One hand out to the side, one leg forward, the other sort of resting, although in ours he rests his arm on that large post, which we'll talk about, right? So the artist's choice to focus on this particular scene is an incredibly important one for the foundation of America, right? Washington steps down, and it is the people who call him forth for service. It was not his own doing, right? He is answering the will of the people. And so the statue in Richmond, the painting in the under the Capitol Dome, both reflect this idea, how important that is. By the way, we have that costume in the Smithsonian. I found a picture of it online when I'm teaching an American art class, right? Also, what's fascinating about both of these is we haven't quite hit the Washington official portrait that we all know on the dollar bill yet, right? That sort of develops in the early 19th century. Udomo's picture was actually, he used a life mask. He sort of put, straws up Washington's nostrils and put plaster on his face, and actually got a mask of what Washington looked like from life and used that to carve the marble statue that you see here. Now, with this idea, I'm sorry this is a little bit blurry, that Washington has stepped down, we have a lot of interesting little things that appear within this. Not only do we have this walking stick, but you can see that hanging from that post is his sword, right? So he's put aside the symbol of war. He's put aside his weaponry. And hanging next to the sword is this big object here, right? This thing, right? That is, in fact, a plow. An old school plow. So the heavy wooden weight that ties to the horses with the pins for the team of horses, and then the blade of the plow down below. Again, a symbol that Washington is no longer army, and is now farmer, right? But obviously it also would conjure up, to most people who've seen it, a famous verse from the book of Isaiah in the Bible, talking about the coming of the Messiah, right? The coming of the Prince of Peace, and it says that they will beat their swords into plowshares. In other words, they will take the swords to the smith, right, to the blacksmith, and heat it up, and they will turn this weapon of war into an implement of peace, a plowshare, where you can, and Washington's statue fits directly into that same thing, right? A time of peace has succeeded come after the time of war. Right? Now you'll also notice that he's leaning his arm on a post that is actually made up of a bunch of smaller rods, sticks, branches that have been bound together. Right? Can you see that very clearly there under his arm? This is not a single solid post, but a bundle of sticks, right, that have been bound together. This is an old Roman symbol. And again, neoclassicism loves ancient art, right? Ancient symbolisms. And the Romans called them fasces, a bundle of sticks. That's really what it means in Latin, right? A bundle of sticks. And in Roman symbolism, it's usually bound up together with an axe. And it's a military symbol that means that as a group, sticks, we are stronger than we are individually. Right? And that we can then fight against a stronger group if we bound together in like-minded pursuits. Right? So the fasces, and this is by the way where Mussolini got the term fascism, came from the same idea, right? Washington didn't know that. That's later. Right? But you'll see that he's actually sort of picked up that symbolism, right? Instead of the axe, however, and this is kind of the cool thing, right? Instead of the axe, you got the plowshare, right? Or the unused sword. So it's not like we're bonding together, to fight an enemy. We're bonding together to be great, to support, right? The fasces. So this is an element that's picked up by Oudon for Washington's statue. But once you realize this symbol, once you recognize the symbol, it's everywhere in American symbolism. It's just like you pick it up and we see it places you didn't recognize it. Old Mercury dime, there it is, right? Next to the phrase e pluribus unum. Isn't that the perfect symbol? Right? Out of many, one. Right? One from many. That's exactly what the fasces is. If you look at more contemporary dimes, there's a torch instead, and it still looks just like a fasces, but instead of the axe, you get a torch growing on the top of it. Lincoln's got it on the sides of his throne, down at the Lincoln Memorial as well. There they are, two poles making up his throne that are also fasces. They're really everywhere. And I'm just going to stop there because we could see it again and again and again and again. Right? It's here for Washington because, of course, this is part of who we are, right? As Americans, we are all together for the good of the country. We are all, it's not just one person, but it's the strength of the community. So Oudon includes a lot of elements with this, some of them coming out of ancient art that help to amplify, again, the theme of Washington as the leader who stepped down on the one hand to eventually be called forth, right? To serve as the first president, but not somebody who simply parlayed what he had, right? The other really famous image of Washington locally, there are actually two versions of this, right? One's in the Smithsonian American Museum, the other one's in the White House. So if you're watching the CNN, you might see behind somebody talking in the White House at some point. But this is the one that's in the National Gallery. Gilbert Stuart painted Washington on a number of different occasions. And as you can tell from looking, he's one of the ones that's responsible for getting the official portrait of Washington that we've come to know and love and recognize on the dollar bill, right? And this is an important moment later in Washington's career. So the Oudon portrait is between military and presidency, right? He stepped down from one, he has yet to take up the other. Stuart's portrait was commissioned to commemorate the end of his presidency. Right? This is the last year he's in office. In fact, he dies like 3 years later, right? He dies in 1799. And we see him is symbolically giving that up as well. Right? Because again, this is very important. As the ex-leader of the country, Continental Congress as the first one elected president. He could have been president for life. Right? I mean, he really did have that kind of popularity and that kind of support. But the point is that he chooses not to, right? And for us, again, the foundation of this country and the ideals that we hold true, this is very important that it is a term limit, right? That you cannot be president forever. So again, he's standing up from the presidential chair, right? To give that up. It's almost like he's rising to greet us, isn't it? He's got his arm up to the side saying, hey, Susanna, so glad you're here. But it's not really looking at you, right? But somebody is coming into the room and he sees fit to stand and greet them, right? He still holds the sword, but what's fascinating is he points the tip down. And throughout the history of art, particularly in ancient art, a sword pointed down is a sign of surrender, as opposed to that, right? A sword pointed down is a sign of surrender. So he is not taking up arms. He's really actually using it to indicate surrender, the end of his term. Right? And he gestures out to the side. In fact, in a pose that looked very similar to him handing over his resignation letter in the picture in the Capitol Dome. But it's a pose that people were using for Washington that was again modeled after ancient Greek art. This work, Apollo Belvedere, was only unearthed in the early 18th century, like 1730, 1740. Right? It was dug up. And when it was dug up, it was praised extensively by historians. They looked at it and they said, this is by far the single most beautiful work of Greek art anywhere in the world. So that's what Stuart is using as the basis for Washington. The work of art that was universally considered to be the single most beautiful example of Greek art. Nice parallel, right? Or about he's the sun god, right? So these kind of make nice parallels. He's not saying, however, that Washington's a god. What he is saying is Washington's particularly special. Right? Did you get a chance to see this in the Vatican when you were there? Yeah. Yeah. That's one of my students when I was there, in the black hair in the corner, right? Couldn't get her out of the frame when I was taking my picture, right? If we look at how Stuart has used that gesture that he got from the Apollo Belvedere, you'll notice that the hand that's extended is doing more than greeting somebody. It's actually seems to be indicating what's on the table. And you'll notice that if we look at the two hands, one on the sword, the other one over the pen. Right? Again, we think about these sayings. The pen is mightier than the sword. He's giving up service, right? Giving up power, and is going to turn his life to become a man of letters, right? A man of thoughts and versus a man of actions, right? His life from this point forward is the life of the mind rather than the life of service activity, right? And so Stuart has sort of keenly brought this stuff together. I love the realism. I love that little silver ink pot with the dog. I want one of those, right? And we can see his quill pen there in the writings as well. So his hand that extends out is actually showing us his future, right? One is the past, one is the future. And he's now moving on to sort of the next phase of his life. Beneath the table, notice the table leg. What is that? The fact sheets again, right? Down below, we have the history of the American Revolution and the Constitution and laws of the United States, right? So again, he's indicating where he's going now. This is now a time that's going, we're not going to be governed by military might anymore. We're not governed by law, right? And this is the important, this is our future. United States. Oops. Right? The one that's in the White House has the other T. Right? The one in the Smithsonian is missing. So one has a typo, as it were, the other one does not. That's really one of the few ways you can tell the two of them apart. They're exactly the same size. Right? Why between the two, I don't know off the top of my head. Right? So Washington here, sort of again, between phases. He's now going finally to retire to private life from this point forward. And this idea that he's indicating that military times are behind us, what's ahead is a time of thoughts and laws, is driven home by the rainbow behind his elbow. Outside the window, we see a promise, right? A rainbow is, again, biblical in its symbolism. A rainbow appeared to Noah as the ark found dry land. And it was interpreted to Noah as being a sign from God that there would never be another flood. Right? That was necessary because we screwed up so bad. But God said, we've done it, you've learned your lesson, it's not going to happen again. And the rainbow is the sign. Right? That there will never be another flood. In this case, the rainbow picks up that metaphor. That instead of the flood, we've got the war. Right? That doesn't have to happen again. Right? God's promise that we are now entering a time of accord, entering a time of peace. So again, if we think about how artists are deploying details, some of them learned from ancient Greek art, we're finding really these are used to amplify the kinds of meanings that the work of art projects to us. Right? So this is neoclassicism in a nutshell, right? This great reverence for ancient Greece and Rome, the Italian Renaissance, a working method that leans toward academic engagement with the subject, where you study every part of it. Part of that is figuring out what other works of art you might quote to get us there. Okay. And then also using these past elements to amplify meaning and even think about what's going on right now. It's in my notes, but you know the Watson and the Shark? Guy in Havana Harbor's lost a leg. He's about to be rescued. Think about what that meant to the Brits. Right? They just lost the colonies out there. You can see there's another example of Virtutis, right? Okay, so while neoclassicism is really all the rage in the late 18th century, there's another movement that begins to run parallel to that. And this movement is called Romanticism. Now, it's also based on Enlightenment philosophy. It begins around the same time as neoclassicism, which is to say the end of the 18th century. But it lives a whole lot longer. And we can argue that there is Romanticism still going on around 1900 in some circles. Now, what is Romanticism? First, the term romance used very, very differently from the way that we think about it. It has nothing to do with love, right? It has to do with a mindset. And the Romantics were something we see in art, we see it in poetry, we see it in theater, we see it in literature, we see it in music. Romanticism is based on the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He's our second most famous Renaissance philosophe, French philosopher, contemporary with Voltaire. And we've talked about him before. He's the one that wrote about the importance of family, direct tutelage from your mother, right? Passing on these ideas. Well, Rousseau's most famous direction of inquiry was his interest in freedom, the freedom of the individual. And as he writes his philosophy, he says that his most famous quote is, mankind longs to be free, but everywhere he is in chains. And he means the chains sort of metaphorically, the things that keep us from being free. And this was taken by the revolutionaries in France and America as meaning freedom from the chains of tyranny, of monarchy, of people who are in control, not by the will of the people, but simply because they inherited it. Right? That is a chain that binds us as a people. But it also came to mean something more than just politics. The chains that bind us in Romanticism are anything that keeps us from exercising our expressive freedoms. Rules and regulations are chains that bind us. Old, outdated institutions in society are the chains that bind us. Logic and rationality are chains that bind us from free expression. These are all elements of romantic philosophy, romantic ideas, is that we should try to strive for something that's freer. Is this making sense so far a little bit, right? We're looking for freedom. Now, again, it's running parallel as it begins to neoclassicism, but in many ways it's the opposite side of the coin. Neoclassicists said that rational thought would make us better citizenry. Romantics say, on the other hand, that rational thought keeps us from being truly human, and that we can, in fact, become more human if we can be freer with our expressive creative abilities, right? And this is part of the reason why Romanticism has a much longer life, is that interest in sort of individual expressive freedom. Right? It makes it much more appealing further down the road. Okay? So when we look at romantic art, and this is true for poetry, this is true for drama, this is true for music, right? We find that the Romanticists are interested in a couple of sort of prominent themes that we'll look at in art. Okay? The first of these is the fact that, where do we find freedom? How do we find freedom? We find freedom often when we talk about losing rationality. Now, how do you lose rationality? What parts of our existence are irrational? Dreams, pretty freaking crazy stuff, right? Drug use, right? We see that, I'm not going to see any pictures of that, but we have romantic images of drug use, right? Death, the ultimate freedom from any kind of constraint. These become themes that the Romantics absolutely love. And what happens when we look at romantic painting is that it's much darker, much gloomier, I think kind of much cooler than neoclassicism. Because they focus on these times when rational law doesn't constrain us. So where Voltaire and the neoclassicists would love ancient Rome, the Renaissance, right? The Romantics loved the Middle Ages because it was guided by faith versus reason, right? Belief that's not constrained by fact, right? So with Goya, who is, as you might guess, Spanish, because now he's a whole range of beans and things in the grocery store, right? Is often put forth as one of the primary romantic artists. And as we look at his works, we will see images that focus on a lack of reason. He still seems to be warning us against it, but there seems to be reveling in it at the same time, right? And these two works, these are prints, these are etchings from a book that he published called Los Caprichos, loose translation, The Follies of Mankind, Los Caprichos. And you can see they're numbered. These were number 42 and 43 in the series. I think there were 82 total, 80-ish. Pretty sure it's 82. Started off with a portrait of Goya himself. And again, they're all etchings like Rembrandt's etchings, right? We talked about etchings before, right? You cover the plate with wax, you draw through the wax with the needle, you put it in acid. We talked about this, right? Maybe it's online and you haven't seen it. Have you played back the online lectures yet? Yeah. Okay, we'll go back, we'll talk about this. So this is another printmaking form. It's kind of similar to engraving. Remember engraving? Okay, that part we remember, right? You're cutting a metal plate, rubbing ink into the lines, polishing off the flat, smooth parts, is what defines engraving. Because engraving, you're carving with a sharp steel bit, right? Etching simplifies it, at least muscle-wise, right? What you do in etching is you cover the surface of the plate, it's all smooth, with a very, very thin layer of wax. You then take a sharp needle, any kind of drawing instrument, you draw through the wax, burying the copper plate underneath, right? So you basically is just drawing in the wax, okay? You then take that plate and you put it in a bath of acid. Now it's not like Breaking Bad acid, right, where it would just dissolve your body, right? You stick your fingers in it. If you don't have cuts, it doesn't hurt, right? The acid is strong enough to bite the plate, the metal in the plate. This is in it for 20 minutes, right? Bite the metal in the plate where you've drawn through the wax, but the wax keeps it off of the other parts. Then you take it out of the acid, you clean off the wax, and you've got those lines that you used to have to carve, right? That's an etching, okay? It's etched by the acid, right? You then take it like you did an engraving, you run it through the point, and you get multiples, right? Rembrandt was a fantastic etcher. There's a section on the online stuff that you're supposed to do to make up for our lost time that talks about the process. Okay? Goya is an etcher as well. Okay? So these are prints that he editioned independently and then bound into a book, right? All those signatures. Okay. So the series of these etchings now show us foolishness. Okay? Now he's not really championing it, but he does seem to sort of take some joy in showing it, which is what puts him into the romantic camp. So on the right, this foolishness kind of falls into a Peter Bruegel style foolishness, which is like what stupid things people do, right? So in this case, and the titles tend to be a little elusive. They who cannot. We have people carrying donkeys on their backs. What stupidity! The whole reason we bred donkeys, burros, right, was to be beasts of burden. They are bred to work for us, to carry things on their backs. Why would you ever carry a donkey on your back? Right? That's the basic theme here. Okay? Halfway through the book, roughly at the halfway point, we get the most famous image from the book, which is the sleep of reason produces monsters. And the title here is written in reverse on the little table where our sleeper rests. Right? And in this case, it's where does stupidity come from? That's what the print focuses on. And in that way, it becomes the centerpiece of the book. Where does stupidity come from? It comes from reason falling asleep. Right? When I was an undergrad and I saw this, I always misinterpreted the theme as a nap where you wake up thoughtful. Right? The sleep of reason. I'm taking a little nap so I can, I'm refreshed. But it's not. It's reason taking a nap. Right? Reason disappearing. And what happens when reason disappears? Monsters come. We stop thinking about things rationally. We start thinking about them as a series of monsters that attack us. And so our sleeper, it's not a self-portrait because you can't see his face. Although people usually talk about it and say it's a self-portrait. Right? He's either been writing or drawing, and he's fallen asleep, and as he does, the creatures of the night are all around him. These are his nightmares, dreams surrounding him, right? Bats and owls and that lynx kneeling behind him. He's beset by the creatures of the night. He is filled with only fear. That is what happens when reason falls asleep. Right? And what's interesting about the prints is that some of them are funny. And some of them are really dark, like really evil. Here comes the boogeyman, and just terribly frightening looking, right? And the idea, of course, is that the sleep of reason allows these things to happen. Whether it's on the part of the boogeyman or the people who are afraid of things maybe they do or they don't need to be afraid of. Right? What makes it romantic is the focus on this sort of darker, gloomier, scarier side. Right? hallmark of romantic art, right? So we have a number of these, 83 different ones by Goya. I want to talk a little bit about how he got the images, because it is an etching after all. And the lines here are the lines that he would have scratched through the wax, okay? But if we take that process of something that's water resistant on the plate, only allowing the acid to hit certain parts, right? Okay. There are other things you can put on the plate other than just a painted, consistent layer of wax. And one of the things that Goya, around the time of Goya, he really perfected it, came to realize is that what you could take is the plate is you could take some ground up tree sap, resin, right? You dry out resin, you grind it up, it becomes dust. Okay? You put that in a sack and sort of shake it over the plate, and you cover the plate with this like snow, like cherry blossoms around the base of the tree. Right? And then you heat it up a little bit, and the resin goes from dry powder back to liquid, aqua, right? And they form a pattern, but they don't cover the plate consistently. You can then take that and chuck it in the acid, and the beauty is that you can get one even tone without cross-action, right? Without drawing the entire thing. And the longer it stays in the acid, the darker the tone will get. So what Goya does is he puts it in for a little while, brings it out, covers part of it up, puts it back in for a little while, brings it out, covers another part up, and it allows him to kind of paint in a way, because he gets these wonderful tonalities. So if you look at the jacket of the sleeping man, or the wings of the owl that we see here in the detail on the right, you can see where he stopped it out, right? The acid never hit his hip or his shoulders, right? Although there might well have been aqua tint there. And he started from that, got the basic, like a brush drawing, and then came back in, covered it all with wax, and did the lines, right? So it's a complicated process, but it allows him to achieve a different kind of tone with his works, rather than having everything be lines, right? Yeah.
Is it the same method used to make the background?
Yes, exactly right. So the background you're seeing there really is a good illustration of what aquatint looks like, right? And so all of the glowing bits, it sort of looks organic, right? The white organic bits look like a mud or something, right? Those are the parts where the resin globbed up a bit in the heat, right, and stuck to the plate. And the black bits around it are where the acid actually is, right? And that was etched longer than the table, which has pretty much the same pattern, right? And the parts where it says el sueño de la razón, right, blah, 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 was stopped out even further, right, and never, ever bit in the acid, right? So, we're hoping maybe next fall to be able to do aquatint here. We're working on sort of amplifying our new printmaking studio to do more processes. And aquatint, there's a problem with breathing in resin that we have to figure out how we're going to deal with, right? It's kind of toxic, right? But we're working on it. Now, Goya, interesting thing about Goya. Okay, so Goya as a romantic artist, on one hand, he's very, very, very skeptical of human capacities, the things that we do. And he's also very, very skeptical of social customs and social institutions. And part of this came from the fact that early in his career, he got very, very sick with pneumonia and lost his hearing. Stone deaf. And it made him feel like an outsider. And in fact, by the end of his career, he has this house on the outside of Madrid that people are kind of afraid to go to because he's this crazy old deaf man, right, living there. But that made him feel sort of separated from society, and that allowed him to be this outside judge looking in, right, which kind of fills the caprichos with some of their themes. The paradox is that he was also the court painter to the King of Spain, King Carlos IV. Right? And this is his portrait of King Carlos IV. There's Goya in the back on the left, standing behind the easel with the painting. Looks an awful lot like, if you play the online things, the Velázquez painting of King Philip IV. Goya would have known. Now Carlos is on the right, and Goya's approach to the royal family, he doesn't try to make them look at all nice or attractive. It's really one ugly group of people, right? One by one, if you look at the faces, right? The old lady behind the man in blue. The man in blue is his son, the prince, Ferdinand VII, right? But the woman behind, she's like an ogre, right? As we come around, like the wife, right? And then Carlos is this figurehead who's just covered himself with every medal he can find, right? But fat and ugly, right? And how he got away with this is beyond me. This is like over life size, right? And Carlos seemed to have liked it. I don't know. But the criticism of Carlos from the people was that he was an ineffectual leader, that he was actually just a puppet, and in particular a puppet of his wife, dark hair, who was sleeping with his minister, the man in red, Godoy. And the two of them were running the country, and Carlos was just this fuddy figurehead, right, doing what he was told. That's what people believed. And that led, during Goya's time as court painter, that led to a popular uprising against Carlos IV. Right? And in 1808, Carlos was overthrown in a popular uprising, a coup. Right? Now, this is an important part of history. One of the things we're going to keep coming back to, we already started talking about this when we were looking at neoclassicism, is the importance of sort of historical events at this time. Because there's a lot going on in European history. Okay? So the deposition, right, the overthrow of Carlos IV is actually a pretty big thing. Because what happened when the people rose up against Carlos while Goya is his court painter? It's got nothing to do with Goya, right? But what happened at that point is that Napoleon is over in France, right? It's 1808, so it's 5 years after Napoleon has become the Emperor of France, right? Napoleon wants to overthrow all of Europe. He wants to conquer everything. He wants all of Europe to be like it was in Roman times under one person, only it's him, right? Or medieval times even, right, under the Holy Roman Empire. So he offers Carlos sanctuary. Come on over to France, right? Come to just across the Pyrenees, right? And I'll give you sanctuary, and I'll send my troops in. They'll stop the revolution, and you can go back, right? Great idea. As soon as he gets over to the Pyrenees, Napoleon throws him in prison. And his troops then stop the uprising, but then he puts his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as the new king of Spain, 1808, right? This is a big thing. Okay. That happens. And Bonaparte, Joseph, is the king of Spain from 1808 to 1813, for the next 5 years. Until the British decide that this Bonaparte threat, right, Napoleon threat, is too much to take, and they move into Europe to kick Napoleon out, right? And the first thing they do is they drag him out of Spain, and then they start chasing him across. It's not that quick, but they push him across France. They finally defeat him in 1815 in Belgium at the Battle of Waterloo, right? That's 1815. Okay. So Goya is right in the thick of it. Okay? He's court painter to Carlos. Carlos is overthrown. Through this trickery, a French king is put on the throne of Spain. A bunch of French aristocrats move to become part of the court. Goya stays on. He doesn't give a rip. Right? He's not a nationalist. He doesn't care about the structures of society and rules and morals. Right? He stays on and starts to work for all of the French that are now living in Spain. He doesn't care. Right? It's no money. And it means that when the French are finally pushed out, Goya's got some answering to do, right? Because he's seen as someone who colluded. There's a word that's in our vocabulary these days. Colluded with the invaders, right? And he has to prove himself. But and he says, I didn't care. I was just doing it for the money. And here, I'll make something for the to commemorate, the greatness of the Spanish people. Carlos is kicked out of the throne. Goya stays on as painter to the French that are there. When when Bonaparte is kicked out, Ferdinand VII, the oldest son, is put back on the throne. Okay? And at this point, Goya asks for the opportunity to commemorate the battle, right? And this really famous painting of the 3rd of May in 1808, which was painted now in 1814 after Napoleon's been driven out, commemorates the valiant struggle of the Spanish against these French troops, right? Who've come in to help overthrow or take advantage of the overthrow and then stop the Spanish Revolution. So on the right, we have the French soldiers. We can identify them by their Napoleonic soldiers' hats, right? And they are standing in lockstep. It's in the middle of the night. You can see the box light behind their knees, and obviously the darkened sky. And they are functioning as this firing squad, this anonymous firing squad, right? Some sort of fear in seeing them from the back because they're not human, right? They are just this killing machine. And the people of Madrid, the rebels, are being led out of the city. They've been defeated, but that's not enough. They're going to be executed, right, for the uprising. So they're being led out in trauma up the hill. You'll notice that some of them are monks. You can tell by the hairdo, right? The tonsure on the top with the hair, the circle of hair around. And weeping and travailing and begging for their lives. Right? Goya wants to show them as the real heroes here, the innocent victims of a war atrocity. Right? Now this is a huge picture, right? A good 10 feet across the base. So the figures are roughly getting close to life size here. And Goya focuses on the horror of the scene, so that there's almost no way you couldn't side with the people here, right? Okay, it's Ferdinand. He takes over. It was under Ferdinand that Goya paints this. So here's a close-up of our people asking for mercy, and of course getting none. Who does the guy in the white look like? Jesus, exactly right. Like Christ on the cross. He's a victim. He's a martyr to a greater cause. And Goya chooses this highly dramatic moment, which is just before that white shirt explodes, right? And you recognize this. It's like, my movie references never work. It's Sonny Corleone at the toll booth in The Godfather, right? They just about to, explode everywhere. And Goya drives this point home by the horrifying pile of bodies in the foreground, right? The death and the destruction. And part of this is that very romantic focus on sort of the lack of logic, right? How can people do this to each other? And shows us that horror piled up. Many of our romantic pictures will focus on images where death is put right in your face. And again, death is maybe the ultimate freedom from the restraints of logic. For Goya, he's a bit of a moralist. When logic breaks down, things go bad. Now, this brings up a point that's worth sort of pausing to discuss a bit. And that's the idea of sublime beauty. Have you heard the term sublime before? You ever used that term or ever heard it? Right? We tend to use it for something that's kind of overwhelming, and usually overwhelmingly good. The cheesecake was sublime, right? It's just kind of rich and over the top, okay? Well, the term was actually first defined in the 18th century, 1780s or so, by a guy named Edmund Burke. That doesn't matter, you don't know that. But he was studying aesthetics, which is the appreciation of beauty, right? And he said that as he was studying aesthetics, and this is in the late 8th century, that he said, and I'm sorry this is up, you gotta look at this, but please just look down. He said that all aesthetic experience, and he defined aesthetics as an experience, a reaction to to something that you've seen. And once you define aesthetics as a reaction to visual impulse, then beauty is no longer really part of it, right? It's just a reaction to any aesthetic impulse. And he said, or any visual impulse. And he said that really the important thing is that that reaction is strong. And he started defining the sorts of things that can give us a strong aesthetic reaction. And those things that give us the strongest aesthetic reaction are what he calls sublime. Right? And he said it doesn't mean it's the most beautiful. And he said, in fact, ugliness and horror are often the strongest, most sublime aesthetic reaction. Is that why we slow down on the freeway? You know, when we see a car wrapped on the side of the road. Well, it goes back to the fact that it's very hard to forget horrifying things that you've seen, right? I kind of why I don't do gore movies, you know, because other faculty on campus who really like to go to things like Saw movies. And once I've seen something like that, it's just like, I can't forget it. You know, and I think that's what Burke means when he talks about the sublime. And so as we're looking at romantic painting, and many of which focus on very, very dark themes, and often on bloodshed and horror, part of what's motivating that, right, in addition to Rousseau and his interest in freedom from constraint, a bigger influence actually is this idea of sublime aesthetic reaction. Or even we could call it sublime beauty, which is to say a beauty that isn't necessarily beautiful. Now in modern usage, right, we sort of drop that horror side of things, and we just talk about sort of strength of experience, right? The cheesecake was sublime because it was just so powerfully tasty, right? The banana split, whatever, right? Something that's kind of overwhelmingly tasty. Well, sublime really means something just simply overwhelming. And what could possibly be more overwhelming than the horror of death and something like what Goya presents to us here? If you think this is squeamish, the next one's worse. So, Goya, during the war, between 1808 and 1813, during the French occupation, this was the period when the term guerrilla warfare started. Right? That's where actually that term was coined, because the rebels who were fighting against the French were fighting sort of skirmishes, you know, trench warfare and whatnot, hand-to-hand combat, no real militaries against each other, but just sort of sneaking around, guerrilla, right? Which meant little war. Guerrilla is the little war. And that's what the Spanish rebels were fighting during the French occupation between 1808 and 1813. Goya is there. He's still painting portraits, but he's also witnessing the horrors around him. And so what we're seeing here comes from first-hand eyewitness experiences. He starts another series of prints during this time. The capriccios are done, they're printed, they're published, right? But while the French are occupying, he's going around making sketches, and he makes a series of plates of the horrors of war. And they're just, I mean, they're absolutely horrifying. They're kind of disgusting and revolting, but they're totally sublime, right? It's all about that intensity of human experience. Right? And he gives them these sort of mocking titles. Sometimes there are things like, I saw this, and another one we talk, and this too, right? And in this case, great heroism. We often paint war as being a heroic activity, right? That's how we often want to remember it as the great heroes of war. Well, great heroism with dead. This is what war is really all about. The one massacre of our fellow men. And these are all things that he saw in the Spanish countryside during the French occupation. We don't need to leave that up very long. Sorry this slide is so bad. It looks a whole lot better on my laptop than it does on the screen. This is in the Folger Shakespeare Library up on Cap Hill. Well, that's what Fold stands for. They have a nice collection of works of art that illustrate Shakespeare's plays, and this is a British artist, Henry Fuseli, actually came out of Switzerland, was working in England and does a series of images illustrating Shakespeare's tragedies and comedies, even his histories. And in particular, he seems to focus on supernatural scenes. This is what makes him romantic, right? The supernatural world is not a logical world. It's not a rational world, right? It's a world where strange things happen, where the normal rules of society are suspended. So in this case, I think it's Macbeth. I think it's Act 4 in Macbeth, where he goes and sees the three witches, bubble, bubble, toil, and trouble, right? And they talk to him about the future that's coming, and they point down, and he has a vision of a dismembered head in a helmet, right? And this then tells him of the future that's coming to him. And so here we see worried Macbeth on the left, the three witches all gesturing down. I think it's the head of Banquo, but I'm not 100% sure. Right? Down below. But again, it's dark, it's gloomy, it's creepy, it's supernatural. That makes this work strongly romantic in spirit. He became so interested in Shakespeare, not only because he's working in England and the Brits love their Shakespeare, right? But to capitalize on this, a guy named John Boydell opened up a gallery of works of art illustrating Shakespeare. Hired a bunch of artists, Fuseli's by far the best, to hang paintings in the gallery, right? So Macbeth with the armored head is probably from the Shakespeare gallery. And Boydell, this is early in the history of museums, charges admission, that's rare, see the pictures, and he's got a gift show where you can buy a print after some of the compositions that were there. So Fuseli sells the reproduction rights to his paintings that Boydell then has engravers engrave. Boydell was a printmaker himself. He paid the engravers more than the painters. Right? It was more important than painters. But this is the modern postcard, right? Or the forefather of the postcard. Now we go to the National Gallery, go see our painting, we walk home, and go, oh, I want the Raphael. And you buy a poster or a postcard. Boydell sort of was the first to do that. You could see the picture, and then you could buy a copy of it. So here, again, witches appearing to Macbeth on the right, supernatural romantic scenes marketed now in England, focusing on particular scenes from Shakespeare's plays. Okay, we'll quit there. We'll pick up with Romanticism on Monday and charge through the rest of that. We're running a little bit behind the other class. We're going to try and catch up. That means I'll probably cut some stuff out of what I'm thinking about. Right? I'll be getting you, first things first, your progress reports, like I said, within the next 24 hours, and then I'll move from there after my upper division class gets graded. I'll move to your worksheets and get those back to you with plenty of time that you can review them for as we get closer and closer to the final. Right? I will also, if somebody asks me before class, I'll have a study sheet for you for the final 2 weeks before the final. Right? At that point, I'll have a pretty good idea about how far we might get. Okay? And it will only be since the midterm.